All right, everyone. So here we are with the first chapter, and this is gonna be about the pawns. So I will go through every single piece, such as the pawns, the bishop, the knight, the rook, and the queen endgames. Those are the five, obviously major endgames, and I will throw some other end games as well, some minor, end game theory as well. Okay, let's build it up from the ground up. All right, let's start from scratch. And here we are with the first example. So first two examples are basically about opposition. What is opposition? What do we call opposition? Well, and what kind of oppositions do we know? So there are basically two major ones. So we have close opposition that you can see here on the board. This is a close opposition. Basically, opposition is when the two kings face each other. Close opposition when there's only one square, when they are only one square apart. So like this, d5 and d7. Of course, it can be any. They could be anywhere else. So they could be, for example, on h2 and f2, or on doesn't matter, a3 and a5. Obviously, you get the point, right? So this is what we call close opposition. The goal here, in general, is that as the attacker, you want, or it doesn't really matter what side you're on. It's what matters is that you want to get into the opposition rather than falling into the opposition. So you don't want to lose the opposition. You always want to control the opposition. You want to have that control. All right. So this is our first example, close opposition. So for example here, if it was black's turn in this position, black would lose this endgame. Why? Because black would lose the opposition. Black has to get out of the opposition, and then king can maneuver and push the pawn. If it was white's turn, then white would have to get out of the opposition, and it would be a draw. All right, let's move on to the next example. Okay, so so this one is just these are just two kings, right? So not really much of an end game. I'm just basically showcasing the distant opposition. Okay, so if you actually think about it, distant opposition occurs at the very start of the game, right? So when you actually start a game, no moves, there's already an opposition. But you don't really talk about it because it doesn't really matter, right? But you already have an opposition, a distant opposition. So obviously a distant opposition, what the name suggests, two kings are distant to each other, so obviously more than one square away. This is what we call distant opposition. And so distant opposition can be very, very, very crucial, because with all these tempos that we are going to discuss later in this course, it's going to matter a lot. So I don't want to again fall into the close opposition. I want to control it all the time, and so distant opposition can be a good resource in order to save some tempos. All right, so that's gonna be crucial. Let's move on to the next position, which is key squares. So I think key squares and opposition are the two most important ideas that you must know in a pawn endgame, okay, especially in a pawn game. Obviously, in other endgames, it is going to be relevant if there are pawns on the board, but purely pawn endgames, opposition and key squares are gonna be, super dominant. All right. So with this example, we're going to play a little game. All right. So we have 4 pawns on the board. Okay. No kings. And the goal here is to put the king on the board. Okay. To make sure that the pawn, each individual pawn, is going to be promoted. So we'll go one by one. All right. So we have to place both kings on the board. All right. So if you put the white king, I'm going to put the black king somewhere, and so I'm going to try to defend the position. All right. So let's start with the h6 pawn, and we can ignore the rest of the pawns for now. So h6 pawn, every pawn is going obviously that direction. So what is key squares, or what are key squares? What do we call key squares, right? So let's talk about that first. So key squares are basically squares that if you can control, you basically win the endgame. All right, that's pretty much it, right? So if you control the key squares, you pretty much win the endgame because it secures the pawn promotion. All right, so pawn is 2 squares away from promoting, and it's a rook spawn. Okay, rook spawn is always going to be a tricky one. There are always some examples where there's some stalemate ideas. So the knight pawn and the rook spawn are always a little tricky. There are some exceptions, and rook spawns are usually exceptions. So here there are only 2 key squares. So if you know it, of course, you know it immediately, but if you don't, try to stop the video and where would you, if you can put the king anywhere, okay, your white king anywhere to secure the pawn's promotion, where would you put it? Again, you can stop the video anytime. So obviously one square that immediately pops up is the square G7, right? G7 square is quite obvious, right? G7. All right. What is the other one? So if the king is here, it doesn't matter where I put black king, right? I can put it here. I can put it here. It doesn't really matter because I can come close. Pawn is going to be promoted. What is the other one? The other one is going to be G8. Okay. If I can reach the G8 square with my white king, the pawn is going to get promoted. It doesn't matter if you put the king here. For black, I mean, the pawn is going to get promoted. All right. A mistake would be something like G6. Okay. If you put the white king to G6, I'm going to put black king to either G8 or H8. And if you push the pawn, right, if you just push the pawn, I'm going to stay in the corner. That is game over. It's a draw. All right, moving on to the rest of the pawns here. So from the 2nd rank to the 4th rank, and basically this is basically true everywhere. Okay, from the 2nd rank to even the 5th rank, but it's the rule that I'm about to teach you can be applied, but let's start with from the 2nd rank to the 4th rank. Why? Because from the 2nd to the 4th, the same exact rule can be applied and nothing else. Nothing else. Okay. So the key squares for the pawns on the 2nd rank to the 4th rank or 2 ranks above the pawn and basically in front of the pawn, creating a ladder T. Let me show you. So for the E pawn, it's basically the E4 square, the D4 square, and the F4 square. Okay, very, very, very crucial. Okay, same thing here with the B3 pawn. Okay, so and again, doesn't really matter. If I can control these 3 squares for the E2 pawn or for B3, I can control these 3, right? Again, creating this ladder T, right? No matter where I put the defensive king, the pawn is going to get promoted with the right technique, but really the key thing is the key squares, right? So why do we need to leave like an extra square for the king or for the pawn, right? So if we're talking about the E2 pawn, let's say if these 3 are the key squares, we occupy it with the king. So king is here, our king is here, opponent's king is on E6, right? So there is this close opposition we talked about, but it is white's turn. So, and what did we learn? That we don't want to lose the opposition, right? We don't want to get out of the opposition. So what do? We push the pawn. Okay, so that's why we need that extra square. We need that reserved square with and with the reserved move to make sure that the other. So we basically, this is how we win a tempo, and so this move forces the opponent king to get out of the opposition, lose the opposition. So we can just advance the pawn fairly easy. Same thing applies on B3, right? Creating this ladder T, 2 ranks above, in front of pawns, 3 squares always. So again, let's just quickly go through with it, right? Our king is here, opponent king is there. It is our turn. That's all right, because we can lose a tempo, and that is game over. All right. Fourth, I did not set up a pawn on the 4th rank. You can imagine it would be the same exact technique. When the pawn, the reason why I added an extra d5 pawn is because if the pawn reaches crosses the midline or the halfway line, there are going to be total of 6 key squares. All right, so for here, for the d5 pawn, there are going to be these 6 squares. All right, so these 6. Again, same rule can be applied. So if the king reaches these 3 automatic wins, but again, I'll say it again, the pawn, when the pawn crosses the halfway or the midline, the rank above the pawn is also key squares. All right, so beautiful. We can move on. I think we can move on to the rest. But I prepared a lot of different examples. So if it wasn't clear in this situation because there were no kings and it was you have to imagine it in your mind, I'll show you a lot of examples where we are going to learn it step by step. Don't worry. All right, let's move on. So this is exactly this is another this is a position where basically can learn this this idea of the extra square, right? So here we are in the opposition. Actually, both players are in an opposition. So the question is, whose turn is it? And when you have an extra move with the pawn, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter whose turn is it, right? It doesn't matter. Because we can always lose the tempo. So even if it's our turn, let's say this is our turn, we can just play G4, lose the tempo that needed to be basically just to be able to promote. Now the king, black king, the defending king, has no, time to, no move to waste. So king has to get out of the opposition, and doesn't really matter where you go. If you go left, I go right. If you go right, I go left. I always go the other direction forward. Okay, so if you go to f7, I go to h6. If you go to h7, I go to f6. Obviously game over, but let's just continue with the line. So you go into the corner, that's all right, because again we use the king. One general idea that is pretty much always true in an endgame, that king first. Okay, so there's this other idea of, oh, hey, if you have a passed pawn, you want to push that passed pawn, right? But most of the time it's gonna be all about opposition and key squares. All right, so we just go king g6. Again, we control the opposition after king g8. Why? Or we can keep on controlling because we have g5, king h8, king f7. It should be king h6, right? King h6 is good too, but king f7 both wins actually, because we can just promote the pawn. King h6, king h6. I mean king h6. It doesn't work because I have to go back to the same exact position. But here king f7 works just fine. If the king was on g8, then it would be different, but here it works. Okay, so here's the extra move for us. So now we know what to do. Again, don't worry, we'll see more and more examples, and in the PGN that you get with the video course, you'll see all the examples that I'm showing you here. Okay, so let's move on to the next one. So here, again, we have the opposition, right? And black has the opposition too. Question is, whose turn is it? If it's white's turn, it's a draw. If it's black's turn, so if it's white's turn, it's a draw. If it's black's turn, white wins. Why? White has no extra move with the pawn, no move to waste, and black suffers from this same disease. So it's a matter of whose turn is it, right? So let's just look at what if black's move is it. So black goes king b5, king b5 doesn't really matter where it goes because I'm always going the other direction. King d4, king c6. Again, you can stop the video at any time and think about, okay, how can I continue this this endgame? All right. So remember, always remember, it's all about opposition and key squares. Those two. Have the focus should be on those two. Okay, nothing else. King c4, again, game over. King b6, king d5, king c7, king c5. Again, I'm not pushing the pawn. The pawn doesn't need to be pushed. Okay, you don't need to push it. It doesn't matter. And what matters is the control with your king. Okay, king b7, king d7, king b6. Again, going the other direction. No matter where it goes, I mean the king, we always go the other direction forward. Okay, so, and now basically it's game over. The only thing is that if the king goes to d6, right, now I want to push c4 to stop the king from coming to d5, and then boom, 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 I push the pawn with the help of the king, go to b7, and that is going to be game over. Perfect. So this is the position. This is the same exact position, but it's a draw because it's white's turn. Okay, or let's talk about what happens if white's turn. King goes somewhere, I can just keep the opposition. Okay, and if you whenever the pawn is ahead of the king, it's pretty much always going to be a draw. Okay, so king goes here, opposition, and doesn't really matter where we are because we are not gonna fall into the opposition anymore. Okay, perfect. Let's move on to the next one. this is another exercise of a key square. So think about it. Always think about key squares. So what are the key squares for the c3 pawn? Try to remember what we learned. Always, it's pretty much always going to be 2 ranks, 2 files above the pawn, right? In front of the pawn, creating this ladder T. All right, creating this ladder T. It does matter where the pawn is. If it's on the 5th rank, it's a little different, as we learn. If it's on the rook's file, it's also going to be a little different. But here, just a standard C file, pawn on C3. So we know that these are the key squares, correct? So so now we can just simply try to occupy these, control these squares, and we do it by going to C2. Weird, right? You'll see it in pawn endgames that sometimes the shortest way that to your eye or to our eyes, sometimes it's not even the shortest way. So would be logical, right, to go to D2. But if you go to D2, I go to E7, right? And it looks like it wins because king D3, and if I go king D6, I have king D4. Ooh, perfect, right? Perfect, because I have the opposition. If you go here, I go here. Again, you have to lose the opposition. Perfect. The problem is that if you go here, I'm just going to keep the distant opposition, and that's why I said distant opposition is going to be key as well. In order to play with these key squares, because if we have to, we lose a tempo, keep the distant opposition to meet the opponent's king at the right time with the close opposition. So we go king to D7, all right? And no matter where you are, I'm going to match it, okay? If you go E3, I'm just going to match it with distant opposition. If you go to E4, I'm going to match it with close opposition. No way to make progress here. Same thing here. Same, not this move. Let's go with king C4, king C6. No way to make progress. All right. So again, sometimes the closest route isn't really the shortest one. Okay. So we go king to C2 first. Okay. Crucial. King E7. King goes to B3, now king D6, and now we go king B4, okay? Black king is 1 square away from covering all these 3 squares. Black does that, so it looks like it's a draw, but it's not gonna be a draw. Why? Because I'm just playing king to C4, and black has to lose the opposition, all right? Perfect. Let's move on to the second one. Again, another example. I think now you're starting to get the point. Hopefully, again, you can go back, watch this video again, or replay it multiple times if you have to, if you're not 100% sure, or if my explanation wasn't as clear to you. So here D4 pawn, right? D4 pawn. What are the key squares for the D4 pawn? Okay, I'm not trying to be too repetitive. I got this comment in one of my other video courses that I'm sometimes too repetitive. I'm sorry, I do ramble sometimes a lot. I'll try not to, and I'll also try to. Sometimes I do over explain. I really just want to make sure that my message gets across to you, obviously. So D4 pawn. What are the key squares for D4 pawn? You all know it's going to be these 3, creating this ladder T. How can we do that? King is fairly close. King is like 2 squares away to from controlling these key squares. So if you go king e5, I'm just going to king e7. There's this close-up position, and there is no way to make progress because I have to lose this opposition. I have to get out of it. I fell into it, and the opponent got into it. I won this other way around. Okay, so we start with king to d5. Actually, all right, we start with king to d5, and when the king goes to e7, we can just go to c6. That is game. Again, king d8. Do not rush with your pawn pushes, okay? Do not rush with your pawn pushes. First, it's always going to be the king, okay? King, opposition, key squares, game is over, bada bing, bada boom, and game over. All right, perfect. Let's move on to the next one. Yes, so now the pawn has crossed the midline. So this is another exercise for you. Really, making sure that you get the point, but that's all right. I mean, practice makes perfect. I would rather show you hundreds of different positions like this. It's not going to be 100, don't worry. Hopefully you got the point already. But it's just really, if you go through all these examples multiple times, 3rd rank, 4th rank, 5th rank, 6th rank, doesn't matter, you will learn. All right, so here pawn cross midline, so there aren't just 3 squares, right? You don't necessarily have to create the ladder T here. Now we have 6 key squares, and we already occupy 1, but good thing that we can get into the opposition by playing king to f6, and it's gonna be game over. Okay, king, no matter where the king goes, if you go left, I go right. If you go right, I go left. Game over, right? And I go always forward, right? Diagonally forward, right? King e7, f6, f7. Pawn is promoted. Next move, perfection. Okay, as I said, this is so as I said, knight's pawn and rook's pawns are gonna be a little trickier. So rook's pawn is not as tricky because it's usually a draw, except for a few examples. Knight's pawn is doable, definitely winnable. And in this position does win, but you got to be a little more careful with the knight's pawn because there are some endgame tactics here that you have to be aware of. Okay, so here again, I'm just using the key square, the opposition rule, because I don't want to push the pawn here. Why? Because if I push the pawn, this is why I said endgame tactics come into play, because if I push the pawn, it's going to be a stalemate, and that's not what you want to do, right? So you go king to g6, okay? King to g6. If you go king to f6, okay? If you go king to f6, that's not good either. Although it doesn't, blunder the game, it doesn't blunder the game away, it's not a draw, but black can be quite tricky with king h7. So not king g8, because king g6 is, we're basically reaching the same position, right? And that's game. But black goes king h7. Beautiful move. Reason being is white has to be super careful. If white plays g6, for example, it is a draw immediately. Why? Because king goes back to h8, again using and taking advantage of the pawn being very close to the edge of the board. So there are again some endgame tactics. And so no matter what I do, if I go king f7, it's a stalemate. If I go g7, king goes frontal defense, and it's going to be a stalemate. So I have to play king f7 again, and basically go back into the original position, and then I win the endgame. So it doesn't you know, it doesn't draw the endgame on the spot, but it's not that great either. Okay, so you have to lose the tempo. Well, with this one, you don't have to. So king g6, king g8. Again, the pawn crossed the halfway line. So, you know, the same idea can be utilized here. Again, just with the added stalemate tricks. It is a slightly more difficult. Now we go king to h6. The reason for king h6 is to, of course, stop the king from going to h7. King h8, g6, king g8, g7. Next move is going to be king h7, pawn push. That's GG. Perfection. All right. Let's go with this one. So another example. It's a little different. Again, because there are two pawns now, so I just added an extra pawn, right, to present another tactical idea in the endgame. So king attacks the d7 pawn, and actually very close to the f5 pawn, and our king on b5 is lagging a little bit, so I have to activate it. Of course, king c6, king d8, and now you got to be careful. You got to be extremely careful. Reason is because if you push f6, it's a stalemate. Quite clever. If you go king d6, I mean by black, right? So created this tricky stalemate position. Eric Rosen would be very happy about it. Famous YouTuber. If you go king d6, again, it's a stalemate, right? So again, I have to utilize this idea of opposition. So I go king to d5, not king c5 here. Although, you know, you want to get into the opposition, but the pawn is way too far ahead. If the pawn was on f4, it would be okay, but here it's just not. It just doesn't work. So we go king d5, king d7, and now f6. Okay, this is how we can you know, keep the control of the opposition. Okay, king goes away, and now pawn cross the halfway line. We can just promote. Okay, we have this. Okay, perfect. Yes. One of the last examples here, again using the same idea, pawn on g4, slightly trickier position. You can, but very reminiscent to another example that I showed you, the pawn on c3, king on d1, and here's the same idea. Two kings are even further away, or at least it seems like, and here again the shortest route is not going to be the shortest one, so we use again this outflanking maneuver, and but I'll, you know, in the upcoming videos I'll talk about what is outflanking and other endgames too. So king f2, king d7, king g3. Again, these were the key squares, right? Creating a ladder T, and we can occupy it by this. Okay, king h6 is a threat. You gotta defend it by playing king g7, but king g7 can be easily met by king g5. Now we have the control, and that is game. All right, so we have the opposition. King is losing it, and that is game over. Perfection. Okay, again, let's keep on rolling. I want to show you a few more with the oppositions and with the key squares. So here black is attacking, so, and it looks like it's doing very well, because king is ready to control the key squares. But if we are clever with the white, we can actually make a draw here. How? By using the distant opposition again. So it's white's turn now. So if it was black's turn, it's fairly straightforward, right? No matter where the king goes, I'm going to play the same exact move, going to a close opposition, and that's game. But if it's white's turn, It's quite tricky. Why? So because if you go king d2, black is going to match it with king d4. And again, I have to lose the opposition. Go here, and I lost. Okay, because black controls the opposition. Again, same thing. If I go to e2, black is going to match it with king e4. Again, I have to lose the opposition. So here I'm going to use the distant opposition to lose a tempo. Okay, and now if you go here, I can go here, and that's game. Okay, if you go to d4, I go to d2. I'm going to match it, right? And if you go to c4, I can go to e2, and this is what we call a bishop opposition. I did not mention yet the bishop opposition and the knight opposition. It is common, but I feel like I just wanted to talk about the more standard one, that this works also here. Okay, so king d4, and again I'm going to match it beautifully. All right, perfection. Here, defensive key squares. Rook pawn, right? We talked about the rook pawn, the pawn on h6. So the pawn now is on a5. Key squares for the rook pawn is going to be b2, b1. Defensive key square is going to be c1. If it's black's turn, we lost because king b2, game over on the spot. Not a4. Do not push the pawn. Do not push the pawn. It's all about the king activity. So king b2, but if it's white's turn, now we can play king c1. We control the defensive key squares. And here we learn another idea. So if you allow me to get into the corner, it's an easy draw, of course. And if you go to a2, trying to block me out, it doesn't work because I can just trap your king into the corner actually. So a4, king c1, a3, king c2, and the king is cornered. King is trapped. King a1, king c1, and no way to make progress because a2 can be met by king c2 and immediate draw. All right, perfection. Yes, same thing here. h2 pawn, pawn going this direction. Two key squares here, right? Two key squares here. Black defensive square is this or this. Now it depends on who moves, right? So if you move first as black, easy draw because I can get into the defensive square and uses the trapping idea, and easy peasy, right? But if I go right in this position, I can just play king g4, right? King g4, king c5, king f5, king d6, and king f6. I'm trying. I can block your king's movement. Basically, this is what we call shouldering, but we'll talk about it later. And as you can, and as you saw in this funky position, it doesn't really matter how many pawns you have on the h file. It's going to be a draw no matter what. So even if there are tons of pawns like this, I know it's a ridiculous example, but I just wanted to show you how irrelevant the rook pawn is if it's defended correctly. All right, and this is a practical example. So this was played in 1907 by Spielman, and Spielman back in the day, he was of course in the early 1900s. He was considered a good player. It wasn't his best day. Basically, rook pawn, rook and an extra pawn against a rook. It's a draw if the defender knows how to defend the position. Here, it's like black made zero progress here, so it would basically any move would be a draw here. White thought that he could get into an opposition and into a drawn pawn endgame with rook f4, and okay, you can stop the video. How can you win here? Can you take the rook, or is it good? Is it not good? What about that? So obviously you can't take the rook because then you're not controlling the key squares. You don't have the opposition, and you're not even moving the rook away, okay? Because that would be a draw too. But with king g5, white is in a pin, and so white has to take. King takes back, and basically white loses the opposition here. No matter where you are, or no matter where you go, sorry, I go the other direction. That's game. All right, and these are gonna be for the next video. Yeah, so let's move on to those. All right.